Elam and Persis are toponyms, yet ones which have traditionally been elided with a social dimension, for in fact toponyms, ethnonyms, and gentilic suffixes or nisbas are often deeply intertwined. In the 19th century, most scholars were in no doubt that the Elamites and Persians represented not only two different nations or peoples in the far from straightforward sense in which Herodotus deployed the terms ethnos and genos, as clearly demonstrated by Christopher Jones many years ago, but ethnically, racially, and linguistically discrete entities. The separation of Elamite and Old Persian linguistically was deduced decades before the concept of Indo-European, Indo-Aryan, or Indo-Germanish entrenched a barrier of dissimilarity between them and predated any speculation on the ethnic or racial composition of the Elamite and Persian populations. Long before excavations even began at Susa and Persepolis, linguistic heterogeneity in the Achaemenid period was postulated by Carsten Niebuhr, who in March 1765 made the first accurate copies of texts engraved into the stone walls, door frames, and staircases of Persepolis, deducing, although he could not of course read them, that these texts were written in 3 different alphabets, drei ganz verschiedenen Alphabeten. It took over a century before what Friedrich Munter called System B, and Georg Friedrich Grotefend referred to as the zweite Schriftart, second writing system, was correctly identified. Munter, Anton Lichtenstein, and Grotefend suggested it was Pahlavi. Saint-Martin, followed by many others, including Vestergaard and Hinks, thought it was Median, and Rawlinson considered it Scythic, whereas Isidor Löwenstern in 1849 was the first to argue that it was Elamite, ascribing it to the quote, primitive inhabitants of Persia, the Elamites. Nevertheless, misled by the designation of Elam as a son of Shem in Genesis 10:22, he mistakenly assumed that Elamite was a Semitic language. Putting aside the strictly linguistic issue, an explicit racialist and ethnic perspective was prompted by Marcel Dieulafoy's discovery of the well-known archer's frieze in the palace of Darius I at Susa during the winter of 1884-85. The dark pigmentation of the skin of some of the archers initially prompted Dieulafoy to suggest that the Elamite dynasties were descendants of black Africans related to the Ethiopians of Upper Egypt. A.H. Sayce, however, was critical of Dieulafoy's position, noting, quote, it is difficult to understand how a black-skinned dynasty could have been transported from Africa to the mountains of Susiana, and the thin lips and bushy beards of the figures prove that they did not belong either to the Negro or the Nubian race. Dieulafoy later revised his views, instead referring to the dark-skinned Achaemenid archers as negritos, a term which he stressed he used in a strictly anthropological sense. As I've discussed in an as yet unpublished paper in the Festschrift for Pier Francesco Cagliari, the term negrito, a Spanish diminutive for black, is a designation applied by anthropologists to a shared phenotype among various contemporary groups of hunter-gatherers in Southeast Asia that is characterized by dark skin, short stature, and tight curly hair. According to the so-called Negrito hypothesis, the Negrito populations of the area are descendants of a region-wide pre-Neolithic substrate population. Opponents of this view argue, on the other hand, that Negritos represent a phenotype spread across the Philippines, Malaysia, the Andaman Islands, and peninsular and island Southeast Asia that resulted from convergent evolution. A 2012 workshop at the Musée de l'Homme in Paris, entitled Revisiting the Negrito Hypothesis, was unable to reach a satisfactory conclusion as to which view is correct. Putting aside for the moment the fact that modern Negrito populations are distributed far to the east of Susiana, Dieulafoy and some of his contemporaries believed that the identification of Negritos on the Susa archer's frieze was bolstered by the ethnographic investigations of the zoologist Frédéric Housset, who was a member of Dieulafoy's team at Susa. After the end of the 1884-85 season of excavations at Susa, Sayce and the civil engineer Charles Babin were sent off to photograph the monuments at Eshkafti Salman, Kulifara, Nakshi Rustam, and Persepolis. In traveling overland, they encountered, as Sayce put it, populations belonging to very different races: Arabs, Susians, Lurs, Bakhtiari, and Persians. Noting that contemporary anthropologists knew virtually nothing about the modern population of Susiana, Sayce suggested, on the basis of his ethnographic observations, as published in several papers at the time, that as far as the ancient population went, the only viable basis for speculation was the collection of glazed brick wall reliefs illustrating Achaemenid spear and bowmen. All who had seen these agreed, he wrote, that it was easy to identify a black element in the ancient population, whereas archaeologists supposed this was due to admixture or introduction of people from Africa, as Dieulafoy had originally suggested in invoking the Ethiopians of Upper Egypt. Anthropologists preferred to attribute it to the Negritos of India and Oceania. The black faces and hands, the hair and beards of the warriors of Darius, he wrote, demonstrate that in antiquity, Susiana was inhabited by a black Negrito population related to that of India, while a Caucasian population, that is the Persians, gradually forced into the mountain recesses of southwestern Iran. These views, with some modification, were adopted by many scholars in the late 19th and early 20th century, including the archaeologist and founder of the Corpus Vasorum Antiquorum, Edmond Potier. Noting the presence of both dark and light-skinned warriors on the Susa reliefs, he suggested that the Aryan facial features of the dark-skinned ones implied racial admixture between Negritos and Caucasians in the Achaemenid period. On the watercolors of the archer's frieze panels published by Dieulafoy, he also distinguished a fair-skinned Persian from a dark-skinned Susian contingent. The German scholar Adolf Billerbeck went even further, identifying not 2 but 3 racial types in the Susianische Heer, the Susian army. These were Negritos, Old Mongolians, and white-skinned brachiocephalic Scythians. The Negritos, in his view, were the original inhabitants of Susiana. The Old Mongolians were the inhabitants of the Anshanite mountains, and the Scythians were the population that had inhabited the Zagros since prehistory. A similar view appeared in the first volume of the Cambridge Ancient History, published a century ago in 1923, where the British Assyriologist Reginald Campbell Thompson described Elam as having, quote, a mixed population consisting from early times of a white-skinned race who may have been akin to the Scyths and a Negrito people with a subsequent addition of Semites. Ernest Babylon had a rather different view, suggesting that the dark-skinned immortals, whom he referred to as a famous group of Janissaries, were recruited by the Achaemenid monarchs from amongst the dark-skinned populations of India, noting that, quote, a great number of the figures on the frieze acquired by Monsieur Dieulafoy actually have a skin color of a deep brown. Georg Hüsing, on the other hand, considered the Negritos of Dieulafoy and Billerbeck to be the substrate population, die schwarze Urbevölkerung, of the land. He also suggested that the Elamites, depicted on the Assyrian reliefs, displayed the short stature of Negritos, as well as diagnostic facial and hair features that distinguished them as a phenotype from the Assyrians and other groups depicted on the reliefs. The Elamite Negritos, he believed, were approximately a head shorter than the Assyrians and wore diagnostic headgear. Hüsing also saw their continued presence in the Garmsir of southern and coastal Iran, where a later admixture of Arabs and black African slaves and their descendants had occurred during the past century. That Negrito populations occur in Southeast Asia, from the Andaman Islands to the Philippines, has been clearly demonstrated by biological anthropologists. Yet, assuming the dark black and brown skin pigmentation on the Susa reliefs is intentional and not an accident of firing, for example, the explanation for dark-skinned archers is probably far simpler. Skin pigmentation is directly correlated with latitude, and variations in melanin pigmentation are adaptive, intended to regulate the effects of UV radiation by maintaining foliate levels and allowing for the uptake of vitamin D. Thus, populations living close to the equator have darker skin, while those living furthest from it have lighter skin. Therefore, the presence of dark-skinned archers on the Sousa reliefs is perfectly explicable, as is the presence of some with brown as opposed to black or fair skin pigmentation. Nevertheless, even if the Negrito hypothesis of Dieulafoy, Houssaye, and others is untenable, my digression into this domain has, I hope, served to highlight what for several generations of scholars were perceived as stark phenotypic differences between Elamites and Persians. And of course, whether or not one subscribes to the Dravidian or Proto-Dravidian affinity of Elamite, hypothesized by David McAlpin, and the Elamite classification of the modern Brahmi language, just published in an article by him entitled Modern Colloquial Eastern Elamite in the Pakistani journal Al-Burz, and the Dravidian affinity of the Brahmi population of eastern Iran and Pakistan, as first hypothesized by Sir Percy Sayce, a sharp distinction can be drawn between Old Persian, or the Iranian languages more generally, and Elamite. And thus we come to the crux of this discussion. Given the distinctive toponyms, ethnonyms, and gentilics associated with Elamites and Persians, how are we to envisage their relationship? Leaving aside the unresolved issue of Parsawa and Parsamash, one could imagine Elamites and Persians, both in the lowlands and the highlands of southwestern Iran, occupying adjacent, even overlapping ecological niches, much as Kurds, Turks, and Persians have cohabited parts of Azerbaijan in the past 500 years in an alternately symbiotic and integrated or antagonistic relationship. But there are other ways of thinking about this relationship, ones that are undoubtedly complicated by the cuneiform tradition that recognizes Cyrus II as an Anshanite rather than a Persian, and by Herodotus and the Bisatun inscription, in which Cyrus the Teispid is transformed into Cyrus the Achaemenid. As I argued in one of my Yarshaltar lectures 3 years ago, drawing on a range of anthropological studies, genealogies like the one promulgated by Darius I are legal charters, not historical records. They embody a dual concept and a retrojection of legal and political relationships within and between lineages as pseudo-history. Genealogies are constantly rearranged and realigned for political purposes. Therefore, while some contemporary observers and later readers of the Bisatun genealogy may have been well aware that Elamites and Persians, or Anshanites and Achaemenids, were distinct social categories, the politics, economics, and social dynamics of life in southwestern Iran during the 6th and 5th centuries BC condoned, accommodated, and understood their entanglement. In altering his genealogy to incorporate Teispis, and by implication Cyrus, Darius was doing what tribal and state leaders have done for millennia. Over the past nearly 2 centuries, many scholars have been inclined to view the Elamites as one of the autochthonous populations of southwestern Iran, and the Persians and Medes as latecomers who moved into the already occupied Iranian plateau and adjacent lowlands of Khuzestan. What happened next is, of course, unclear. The situation further north in Azerbaijan and Kurdistan offers a parallel, though interpretations there have varied widely. Maximilian Streck, for example, suggested that with the arrival of Iranian speakers in the region by the late 9th century BC, the indigenous populations of the northwestern Zagros were swallowed up and probably also exterminated, a view shared by Lewis Gray, who wrote of the aboriginal population of western Iran being partly exterminated and partly absorbed by these invaders, and Ludmila Kuzmina, who suggested that the arriving Iranian groups, quote, subjugated and incorporated a part of the aboriginal population. Yet these two options are not the only ones imaginable. As an analogy, one might consider the arrival of large numbers of Turkic speakers in Azerbaijan during the Seljuk period. In the view of the late Pierre Oberling, These Turkic tribesmen overwhelmed the resident Iranian and Kurdish populations, with the result that many became Turcophone, though not necessarily through violence and extirpation. That political alliance and cooperation are, at least theoretically, possible is shown in Frederick Barth's classic study of the Basri tribe of the Khamsa Confederacy in Fars. Founded in the mid-19th century, the Ili Khamsa was an artificial agglomeration created in 1860-61 at the command of Nasr ad-Din Shah of the Turkic-speaking Inalu, Baharlu, and Nafar, the Arabic-speaking groups who had absorbed some Lur and Turkic speakers, and the Basri, a mixed Persophone and Turcophone group that had had chiefs of Arab descent since the Safavid period. The Khamsa were meant to serve as a counterpoise to the influential Qashqai, and in this respect, Nasr ad-Din Shah's scheme succeeded brilliantly, for it kept the rival Qashqai and Khamsa, as well as the Bakhtiari, at loggerheads for decades, which suited the Qajar monarch just fine. It is, of course, unlikely that such a top-down scenario is applicable in the case of the indigenous Elamites and the late-arriving Persians. But the tribal and linguistic mosaic of southwestern Iran in the pre-modern era may yet be relevant. The juxtaposition of Lurs in Pushtiku, Qashqai in western Fars, Khamsa in eastern Fars, Arabs around Khorramshahr and Ahwaz, and Bakhtiari in the north is certainly not a direct analogy to the diversity of Aleppian, Elamite, Anshanite, and Persian social elements, but the coexistence and interactions of these groups, necessitated by proximity and the need for communication, may help us imagine the alternately symbiotic and predatory, or at least confrontational relations that may have obtained between co-residents of southwestern Iran in the Neo-Elamite and Achaemenid periods. That co-location is suggested by, among other things, the fact that roughly 10% of the personal names on the nearly 300 late Neo-Elamite economic texts found on the Acropole of Susa in 1901 and published in MDP 9, such as Bama, Irmaka, Kitika, Pirna, Unukaka, and perhaps Kunaramika, are Iranian or Iranian-related. The term Parsip, Persians, also occurs. This also raises the probable cultural and linguistic diversity of groups broadly characterized as Elamite and Persian, given the size and potentially isolating effects of the folded Zagros landscape. It is not simply that the distinction between Elam and Anšan implies a difference between these two broadly defined regions. Rather, it is the fact that if, as some scholars have suggested, Anšan was coterminous with the later Parsa, and Parsa was coterminous with Fars, then we are dealing with an enormous territory extending from Khuzestan in the west to Isfahan, the Dashti Kavir in the north, to and perhaps including Kerman in the east, and the Persian Gulf in the south. The likelihood that all Elamite and Iranian groups living within this region were internally homogeneous seems highly improbable. If I could offer a crude analogy for the interrelationships of Persians and Elamites, bearing in mind that there were multiple subsets in each category, it would perhaps come from the domain of weaving, combined with longitude and latitude. If we imagine Elamite threads running like latitude parallels from Susiana in the west across Fars, beginning as far north as Khorramabad near Kalmakara, and Persian threads running like meridians from the central Zagros in the north southwards to the Persian Gulf, and intersecting and overlapping along both axes. This may represent one model for Persian Elamite integration. Some areas, of course, may have been more heavily settled by Iranian speakers, others by Elamite speakers, but the point is that mutual isolation is unlikely. How long might such integration have been going on before the rise of Cyrus II? Maximally, we might say since the 9th century, but without wishing to reopen the debate on the southward dispersal of Iranian speakers, the date was probably a century or more later. Be that as it may, if one wishes to think of a long period of Persian-Elamite coexistence covering several centuries in terms of generations, then it would be well to remember what Lucien Febvre wrote in 1929, namely that there is no a priori reason to assume the congruence of different sorts of generations, whether biological or of a particular cultural sort. Considering political evolution in parallel with, for example, the evolution of literary genres, he wrote, there is no guarantee that the political generations of 1660 and 1690 are set apart by the differences and for the reasons that divide the literary generations of 1660 and 1690. The significance of such an observation for the study of Achaemenid and immediately pre-Achaemenid history has yet to be appreciated, but in my opinion is clear. To put it very simply, with a few examples, linguistic changes will not necessarily proceed at the same rate as artistic ones. Assimilation, adaptation, and adoption in the realm of architecture or religious practices do not necessarily occur at the same rate as political changes. 30 years ago, when writing on the concept of an intellectual generation, Jean-François Sirinelli emphasized the importance of what he called its demographic substructure. Discussing the period following World War I, he wrote, "Who could doubt that such profound sociocultural changes did not have reverberations upon the world of politics? I suspect that embedded within Pierre Briand's well-known views on the Elamite to Achaemenid transition as a change in dynastic leadership affected by an ethnoklasse dominante are demographic realities of which we remain ignorant, that help set in motion the gears of political control and population composition, which resulted in the shift from the old Elamite, broadly conceived, to the new Persian reality. That this process spanned an unknown number of political generations and did not necessarily coincide with evolving artistic styles, religious syncretism, subsistence practices, or account technical procedures seems likely. The fact that not all aspects of Elamite identity were fully subsumed in Persianness, however, is perhaps best exemplified by the resurgence, following the collapse of the Achaemenid Empire, of the Elamaean state in the mountains and plains above Shushtar. Thank you very much.